Now, as you know, climate change is real. The reality is that you can't have billions of people on the planet, multiple industrial revolutions, without something happening to the environment. That's just the reality. Just how close we are to disaster, there are many people that are up for the debate. And frankly, most of the absolute over-the-top stuff that it'll never rain again or droughts will run forever, well, of course, those times have mostly come and gone. But the reality is that Australia makes up a very small portion of the world's carbon problem. When it comes to emissions, as I've shown you multiple times, Australia accounts for just 1% of global emissions. Now, lefties try to turn around and say that while we're not 1% of the global population, therefore we are spewing way more than we should, given the size of our population. But the reality is that the countries that are truly polluting the planet at greater number than anyone else on the planet are countries like China, India and the rest of the developing world. Of course, China, in my view, is not a developing country. They've hosted an Olympics twice this century alone, and they have an international space station. But them's the rules. So, of course, one of the ways that Australia is trying to do its bit to reduce the 1% of carbon emissions that we have is to move from the energy system that worked to the one that will be less polluting. Of course, that is a move towards renewable, things like solar and wind. Now, I have long on this program not argued about the existence of climate change. I'll talk about the variables, but the existence of it has not been something I've debated on this program, to the frustration of some, but that's just the reality. It is what I not just believe, but I believe the evidence is there for. But the cost of transition towards a new green economy has been what I have spoken about at election after election after election. Now, I don't mind if Australia was told up front that the cost of these transitions would be X billion dollars and would take Y number of years, and then people would vote upon it. But as you know, the numbers could never be produced by Bill Shorten, so in part he lost the 2019 election. Well, now, take your pick. The suggestions are that it'll cost up to $1.94 trillion for Australia to decarbonise its economy, everything from the energy grid through to more electric vehicles being purchased. Another example of this comes from a group called Net Zero Australia. They say the number is $1.5 trillion. But either way, we are talking about more than $1 trillion, maybe $2 trillion. And of course, globally, supposedly it's going to be the best part of $60 trillion. And I have always said that I searched for a politician to be honest about the numbers. If they were honest about the numbers, well, then people would be able to go clear-eyed into a decision about whether this was the transition they wanted to make or not. Instead, the last election, in part, was about full of touchy-feely conversation, the Teals ripping a series of seats away from the Liberal Party, and I'll get to the promises that were made by the Labor Party that there was nothing but upside in all of this, despite the fact that we now know that it's $1 trillion, according to the CSIRO, $1.5 trillion, or almost $2 trillion in a country that, last time I checked, is planning budget deficits for the next 40 years. Now, this money, of course, comes because you have to literally build new sources of energy creation. It's all well and good to blow up a coal-fired power station, but you need to replace it with something that doesn't store energy, but actually makes energy. And for obvious reasons, you don't need one windmill, you need thousands of windmills. You don't need one solar panel, you need 22,000 of them a day, every day between now and 2030. We have long covered on this program that one of the costs of transition is also to where all of this stuff goes. A perfect example is what is happening in and around the area of Ballarat in Victoria. The AusNet cables. Locals hate these cables. These are the transmission lines that cost billions of dollars to go from where the new energy is being created to being able to send it back to capital cities like, in this case, Melbourne. Now, the protests have been long and loud from the people who don't want power lines over their open fields. But as we've told you, the Victorian government has done everything it can to limit the capacity of local communities to argue against this stuff because the government has decided the greater good is in green energy and bugger the people that are in the bush. Largely, the people who are in the cities who advocate for this stuff agree with that position, but can I give you an example about how people are getting screwed over who've had prime agricultural land? There's one farmer in particular that I want to tell you about. He woke up one day knowing that these power lines were going to be on his property and had started to move across his property. One of these signs said, "Danger, higher voltage overhead power lines do not pass with anything over 3 metres high." Now, this bloke's not driving around in a cherry picker. What he's got is a giant machine that helps him irrigate his farmland. His farmland that, by the way, he and other people affected by this rollout will only be paid for where the towers touch the ground, not the lines that go over the top of their crop. This is a perfect example of cost of transition. This bloke is not able to use the equipment to use his land as he has always used for agriculture, for farming, because of the power lines that are now overhead. The power lines he never wanted, the power lines he's tried to protest against, but the power lines that the Victorian government are just going to push through. And this cost of transition to people's land in regional areas, or to federal and state budgets, or to us, the consumer, and we are now, of course, paying record high power prices. And as much as they want to talk about Ukraine, the reality is that all of this new stuff has to be built, and the customer will have to pay for it. Maybe in 30, 40 years, when you don't have to build any more of this stuff, oh no, you will still have to, because, of course, the life cycle of wind and solar is only about 20 years. So what are we down for? A transition cost of what? $1 trillion every 20 years, meaning permanently high power prices, far from what we were promised. But remember, Australia is locked in to this ridiculous arrangement of the cost of transition that hurts the farmers and screws you over as the normal customer. Because, of course, clapped in by the business leaders, the union movement and all the rest of it, one of the earliest acts of this Prime Minister and his idiot Climate Change and Energy Minister was to sign us up to a guarantee of getting to more than 80% renewables by the year 2030, even if these things are made by slave labour in parts of China, even if the life cycle means there's nowhere to bury this stuff when it needs to be buried, even if there is an increased risk of fire in car parks because of lithium batteries. It goes on and on and on. But politically, the climate change people, in part, have, well, won the political argument because the vibe was always more important, apparently, than the cost of transition. But the cost of transition still remains the reality. The cost of transition is more expensive by the day and impacts more people than ever expected.